In old Europe, a sentence could become a crime if it questioned the wrong doctrine. A book could be burned, a thinker could be silenced, and a private doubt could become a public danger. Voltaire saw something terrifying beneath the robes, rituals, and sacred language of the church. He saw what happens when an institution claims to defend God while gaining the power to punish human thought. The question is not whether religion can comfort the grieving, inspire the artist, or give meaning to a life that otherwise feels random and short. Those possibilities are real, and this channel has never denied them. The question is something sharper, something that Enlightenment Europe could not ignore without cost. What happens when the institution that claims to guard divine truth also claims the authority to decide what questions may be asked, which books may be read, and which minds may speak freely? That is not a question about God. That is a question about power. For centuries across the European continent, that power was not theoretical. It had teeth, it had courts, it had prisons, it had flames for manuscripts, and worse for the people who wrote them. And the thinkers who noticed this pattern, who said out loud that something was wrong, did not always survive the saying. So why did church power specifically terrify the defenders of reason and free inquiry? Why did Voltaire, one of the sharpest and most celebrated minds of the 18th century, spend decades of his life in exile, in fear, and in relentless combat against what he called fanaticism? That is the buried file this episode opens. François-Marie Arouet was born in Paris in 1694 and would eventually write under a name that became one of the most dangerous in Europe: Voltaire. He was not a systematic philosopher in the tradition of Kant or Spinoza. He was something the established church may have found even more threatening: a brilliant satirist with a popular audience, a historian with a memory for inconvenient facts, and a moralist who refused to let the clergy escape examination simply because they wore sacred garments. He was exiled twice from France. His books were burned by order of church and state. He lived for years just across the Swiss border, close enough to Paris to publish, far enough to avoid the Bastille. What made Voltaire dangerous was not merely that he mocked the clergy, though he did that with lethal precision. What made him dangerous was his central argument that religious intolerance, the willingness to punish, silence, exile, torture, or kill those who believe differently, was not a defense of God. It was a corruption of everything God was supposed to represent. He called it fanaticism, and he spent his career documenting its machinery with the precision of someone who understood that ideas, when they are protected by absolute authority, do not stay ideas for long. They become instruments of control. And control, Voltaire insisted, is not the same thing as truth. For most of European history, the Catholic Church did not present itself as one institution among many competing for influence. It presented itself as the singular guardian of divine revelation, the custodian of the deposit of faith, the institution that Christ himself had founded and promised to protect from error. This was not a modest claim. It meant that what the church taught was not merely the opinion of theologians or bishops. It was the Word of God, transmitted through apostolic succession, defended by councils, confirmed by scripture and tradition, and binding on every baptized soul. To question the church's teaching was therefore not simply to disagree with a human institution. It was to place yourself in rebellion against the divine order itself. This self-presentation extended across every dimension of life. The church administered the sacraments through which the faithful believed they received grace for birth, marriage, forgiveness, and death. The church educated children and governed universities. The church collected tithes and maintained vast land holdings across the continent. The church trained the lawyers, the physicians, the scribes, and the theologians who shaped how European civilization understood itself. Its calendar organized the year. Its architecture dominated every city. Its language, Latin, was the shared tongue of educated Europe for more than 1,000 years. The church was not simply a spiritual authority. It was the connective tissue of Western civilization. Within this framework, obedience was not presented as submission to human power. It was presented as wisdom. The individual mind, so the argument ran, is fallible, proud, and easily deceived. The accumulated wisdom of the church, refined through centuries of prayer, scripture, and counsels, was surer than any private judgment. This was not an entirely unreasonable position for people living in a world without universal education, without scientific consensus, without the printing press for most of that history, and without any of the tools that modern people use to evaluate competing claims. The church offered something that felt essential: a coherent universe, a moral structure, a promise that death was not the end, and an authority that could be trusted because it was older, wiser, and holier than any single human being. The sacred quality of church authority was not simply imposed from above, it was experienced from within. People were baptized into the church as infants before they could consent or question. The rhythms of their lives, the seasons of fasting and feasting, the language of prayer, the architecture of the buildings in which they gathered, the music that moved through the nave on Sunday mornings, all of it formed a world that was emotionally and aesthetically complete. When you have been shaped by something since before you had language for it, it does not feel like an institution. It feels like reality itself. There was also the matter of fear and hope intertwined. The church did not simply offer comfort. It offered the only map most people had for navigating what lay on the other side of death. Heaven was real to them. Hell was real. Purgatory was real. The priest who administered the sacraments was not merely a community official. He was the authorized mediator between the human soul and its eternal destination. This was not superstition in the contemptuous sense that later generations would use the word. This was a comprehensive metaphysical architecture that gave suffering meaning, that made mortality bearable, and that connected ordinary human lives to a story that began with creation and ended with judgment. People trusted the church because they needed what it offered and because no alternative framework had yet become available to them. The clergy also performed functions that were genuinely valuable. They maintained hospitals, operated schools, copied manuscripts, cared for orphans, and provided the only social safety net that existed in many regions. The local priest knew his parishioners by name. The monastery was often the only center of literacy for miles. The charitable dimension of church life was real, and millions of ordinary believers experienced it as evidence of divine care mediated through human hands. When the church spoke, it spoke with the combined authority of the sacred, the educated, the charitable, and the ancient. To oppose it was not simply to disagree with a doctrine. It was to stand against almost everything that held the social world together. And yet the institution that claimed to guard truth also claimed the right to determine what truth could safely be known. The same authority that baptized infants and fed the poor also maintained indexes of forbidden books. The same institution that promised salvation also threatened excommunication for those who read the wrong manuscript, asked the wrong question, or aligned themselves with the wrong interpretation of Scripture. At some point, the guardian of truth became the gatekeeper of permissible thought, and those are not the same thing. A guardian protects something real. A a gatekeeper decides who may approach. The crack appears precisely here. If the truth the church claimed to guard was genuinely true, why did it require an elaborate institutional machinery to protect it from examination? Real discoveries in science, real advances in mathematics, real moral insights do not typically collapse the moment someone is allowed to question them. Quite the opposite. They survive scrutiny. They become stronger under pressure. A truth that must be protected by silencing those who doubt it raises an uncomfortable possibility that the protection is not for the truth at all, but for something more fragile, something institutional, something that cannot afford to be examined too closely. Voltaire noticed this. He noticed it with the precision of a surgeon and the fury of a man who had watched the machinery operate up close. If what you have just heard resonates with something you have been quietly thinking for years, if you have felt the weight of questions you were never given permission to ask, then this channel exists for you. Press the like button now, not as a gesture of agreement, but as a signal that you are ready to look at inherited belief through a lens that does not flinch. There are 40 minutes of evidence still ahead, and the archive is only beginning to open. To understand what Voltaire was reacting against, you have to stand inside the world he actually inhabited, not the sanitized version of history that tends to appear in celebrations of European civilization, but the real landscape of ink, fire, and institutional terror that shaped intellectual life for centuries before and during his lifetime. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the official list of books Catholics were forbidden to read, was first published in 1559 under Pope Paul IV, and it remained in force in various forms until 1966. This was not a suggestion. Reading a prohibited book could result in excommunication. Authors whose works appeared on the list faced social destruction, imprisonment, or worse. The index included works by Erasmus, Galileo, Descartes, and eventually Voltaire himself. It was not a fringe instrument. It was official church policy across more than 4 centuries. The wars of religion that tore through Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries were not merely theological disagreements settled by debate. They were catastrophic conflicts in which religious identity became the organizing principle of violence. The French Wars of Religion, which stretched from 1562 to 1598, killed hundreds of thousands of people. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, in which thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered in Paris and across the provinces in a matter of days, was an event that Voltaire would later examine in devastating detail. He was born less than a century after that massacre. Its memory was not abstract. It was part of the living history of the country in which he grew up. The Inquisition, in its various national forms, had been operating for centuries by the time Voltaire began writing. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, was not dissolved until 1834. It processed tens of thousands of cases involving accusations of heresy, blasphemy, Judaizing, Protestantism, and forbidden reading. Torture was an authorized instrument of examination. Execution, specifically burning at the stake, was the penalty for relapsed or obstinate heretics. These were not medieval stories by the time Voltaire was active. The Inquisition was a functioning institution during his lifetime, operating in Spain and its territories with legal authority and royal support. The censorship infrastructure was equally thorough in France. Royal censors had to approve books before publication. The privilege system, through which publishers obtained royal permission to print, meant that the state and the church worked in tandem to control what ideas circulated in print. Voltaire frequently bypassed this system by publishing anonymously, publishing from Geneva or Amsterdam, smuggling books across the border, and denying authorship of his most dangerous works even when the evidence of his pen was obvious to everyone. His famous denials, his insistence that he had nothing to do with a particular scandalous pamphlet, even as his enemies and admirers alike recognized his style on every page, were not simple dishonesty. They were the calculated survival strategies of a man who understood that authorship in his world could be a criminal charge. The philosopher Jean Calas, a Protestant merchant from Toulouse, was tortured and broken on the wheel in 1762 on charges that he had murdered his own son to prevent the young man from converting to Catholicism. The evidence against him was thin. The trial was riddled with confessional prejudice, and the verdict was almost certainly wrong. Voltaire took up his case with passionate fury, writing a series of pamphlets and letters that eventually resulted in Calas being posthumously rehabilitated. But the rehabilitation came after the execution. The machinery of religious justice had already operated, and a man had already been destroyed by it. The Calas affair was not an anomaly that Voltaire invented for rhetorical purposes. It was a documented, historical event that crystallized everything he had been arguing about the relationship between sacred authority and human suffering. Religious authority does not maintain itself in a vacuum. It requires support, and it offers something valuable in return to those who provide it. The alliance between the Catholic Church and the political rulers of Europe was not a conspiracy in the shadowy sense. It was an openly acknowledged and mutually beneficial arrangement that shaped the continent for centuries. Kings needed the Church's blessing to rule legitimately. The concept of divine right, the idea that monarchs derived their authority directly from God and were therefore accountable to God rather than to their subjects, was theological architecture built and maintained by the Church. If the Church's authority could be questioned, if Scripture could be read and interpreted by anyone, if reason rather than revelation was the measure of truth, then the divine right of kings became fragile as well. The clergy benefited from the arrangement in material terms that were impossible to ignore. The Church held enormous tracts of land across France, Spain, the Italian states, the Holy Roman Empire, and the rest of Catholic Europe. In France alone, the Church owned somewhere between 6 and 10% of all land, paid no taxes on most of it, collected its own tithes from the population, and maintained its own court system for cases involving clergy. This was not a spiritual arrangement. It was a feudal one. The clergy were not simply priests and monks devoted to prayer. They were a social class with inherited privileges, legal immunities, political influence, and economic power that depended entirely on the continued authority of the institution they represented. Any serious challenge to that authority was therefore also a challenge to their property, their status, and their power. The universities, which were largely church-controlled institutions through most of the medieval period and well into the early modern era, taught curricula that had been structured around theological categories since the scholastic revolution of the 12th and 13th centuries. Aristotle had been absorbed into Christian theology primarily through the work of Thomas Aquinas, and the resulting synthesis, scholasticism, became the dominant intellectual framework of European education. To propose a philosophy that contradicted scholastic categories was not simply an academic disagreement. It was a challenge to the intellectual foundations of the entire educational system, and therefore a challenge to the authority of the Church that stood behind it. When Galileo proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system, he was not simply contradicting Ptolemy. He was contradicting a theological synthesis that had absorbed Ptolemy as part of its structure. The moral authority of the Church was equally useful to political elites because it meant that social hierarchy could be presented not as human arrangement, but as divine order. The idea that God had placed some people in positions of authority and others in positions of servitude, that the poor should accept their suffering as spiritual preparation for eternal reward, that rebellion against legitimate authority was sin, and that heresy and political treason were often legally equivalent. All of these ideas did political work that made them extremely valuable to the ruling classes. A peasant who believed that his suffering was spiritually meaningful and his obedience to his Lord was divinely commanded was far less likely to organize a rebellion than one who believed that hierarchy was merely a human invention that could be unmade by human action. The censorship system itself served the interests of both church and state simultaneously. When a book was prohibited because it contained heretical theology, the prohibition also typically suppressed any political or social critique embedded in the same text. When a philosopher was imprisoned or exiled for attacking church doctrine, any political analysis that accompanied the theological critique was silenced at the same time. The overlap was not accidental. The systems of religious and political authority had become so thoroughly intertwined that attacking one inevitably threatened the other. This is why the response to Enlightenment criticism was so fierce. It was not just theology that was at stake. It was the entire architecture of social and political order that theology had been used to support. The contradiction at the heart of this arrangement was not subtle, though it required either courage or extraordinary security to name it openly. The Church claimed to possess truth. It claimed that its doctrines were derived from divine revelation, confirmed by Scripture, refined by councils of learned and pious men, and protected from fundamental error by the promise of God Himself. If these claims were true, then the truth the Church possessed should have been extraordinarily robust. It should have been able to withstand examination, debate, satire, and philosophical challenge without flinching. Real gold does not dissolve when you test it. If the faith was as solid as the Church claimed, then open inquiry should have been the Church's greatest ally, not its most feared enemy. But the actual behavior of the institution told a different story. Books were burned not because they were obviously wrong, but because they were dangerously interesting. Thinkers were silenced not after their arguments were publicly refuted, but before their arguments could reach a large enough audience to matter. The index existed not to catalog errors that had already been exposed and defeated, but to prevent ideas from circulating at all. And the punishment for heresy, in its most severe forms, was not re-education or debate. It was torture and death. None of this is consistent with the behavior of an institution that is genuinely confident in the truth of its own claims. It is consistent with the behavior of an institution that cannot afford to have its claims examined too carefully. Voltaire saw this contradiction with exceptional clarity, and he named it in terms that were both philosophically precise and lethally satirical. An institution that claims to possess the truth and then suppresses the tools through which truth is typically discovered, reason, observation, open inquiry, and public debate, is not defending truth. It is defending certainty. And certainty, he understood, is not the same thing as truth. Certainty is a psychological and institutional state. Truth is something else entirely, something that must be earned through examination rather than protected through intimidation. The contradiction deepened when you examined the history of what the Church had actually taught across the centuries. The history of Christian doctrine is not a story of unchanging revelation delivered whole and unaltered from the apostles to the present day. It is a story of intense debate, council decisions that went the other way, theological positions that were once orthodox becoming heretical, and then sometimes becoming orthodox again, and doctrines that were formulated in specific historical contexts and then projected backward as though they had always been believed. The Council of Nicaea in 325 did not simply confirm what everyone already believed about the Trinity. It resolved a bitter controversy that had divided the Church for decades. The doctrine of papal infallibility was not formally defined until 1870. Purgatory as a systematic doctrine was refined through the medieval period. These were historical developments, shaped by politics, personalities, and contingent circumstances. The problem this created for the Church's claim to guard unchanging divine truth was serious enough that Voltaire and other Enlightenment critics did not need to invent it. They simply needed to point at it. If the Church's doctrines were eternally true revelations from God, why had they developed, changed, been contested, and sometimes reversed across history? If the councils that defined orthodoxy were guided by the Holy Spirit, why did they so often align with the political interests of the emperors who convened them? If the scripture that the Church claimed as its foundation was the Word of God, why did the Church resist for so long any translation that would allow ordinary people to read it for themselves? These questions were not the inventions of malicious atheists. They were the logical consequences of examining the Church's own historical record. The final layer of the contradiction involved the relationship between the Church's spiritual mission and its institutional behavior. The Gospels present Jesus as someone who challenged institutional religious authority, who denounced the religious leaders of his time for placing burdens on ordinary people while exempting themselves, who associated with the outcast and the condemned, and who said nothing, at least in the canonical texts, about index lists, inquisitional courts, or the divine right of popes to determine which books the faithful might safely read. However one understands the theological claims about Jesus, the gap between the figure described in the Gospels and the institution that claimed to represent him in early modern Europe was vast enough to drive a philosophical movement through it. Voltaire drove exactly that, with velocity and precision. Voltaire's critique of the Church was not primarily a critique of the existence of God. He was not an atheist in the modern sense of the word. He was what his era called a deist, a position that acknowledged the existence of a creator God, but rejected the idea that this God had revealed specific doctrines to specific institutions that then had the authority to impose them on everyone else. He believed in reason, in morality, and in a universe ordered by something he was willing to call divine. What he did not believe was that any human institution had the authority to claim exclusive ownership of that divinity and use the claim to punish those who disagreed. The central concept in Voltaire's mature critique was what he called fanaticism, or infâme in French, a term he used so frequently and with such obvious contempt that it became inseparable from his name. The phrase he used repeatedly in his correspondence and published works was écraser l'infâme, which translates roughly as crush the infamous thing. The infamous thing was not religion itself. It was specifically the combination of religious authority with intolerance, the willingness to persecute, imprison, exile, torture, or kill human beings in the name of doctrinal correctness. He saw this combination as the most dangerous force in European civilization, more dangerous than ignorance, more dangerous than poverty, more dangerous than military violence, because it claimed a sacred justification that made it nearly impossible to oppose without appearing to oppose God himself. Fanaticism, in Voltaire's account, was not the belief of simple, uneducated people who did not know any better. It was a trained behavior, actively cultivated by institutions that understood its usefulness, a population that had been taught to associate doubt with sin, questioning with pride, and disagreement with heresy was a population that would police its own thinking. The internal censor was cheaper and more reliable than any external one. When people learned to feel genuine guilt at the first stirring of a forbidden question, when they experienced doubt as a spiritual crisis rather than an intellectual beginning, they had been trained in a way that required no further enforcement. The institution could sit at a comfortable distance and allow the psychological machinery to operate on its behalf. What made this particularly dangerous in Voltaire's view was the way fanaticism immunized itself against rational criticism. If you challenged a fanatic's doctrine with evidence, the evidence could be dismissed as the temptation of pride. If you challenged it with historical examples, the examples could be reinterpreted through theological categories that made them serve the original conclusion. If you challenged it with reason, reason itself could be condemned as the enemy of faith. And if you challenged it too publicly, you could be charged with heresy, which meant that the very act of criticism became evidence of your guilt. This was not a logical system. It was a closed loop, and Voltaire recognized it as such. His entire career was an attempt to find a way to break that loop without being destroyed by the mechanism that defended it. His method was primarily literary and historical. He wrote history with philosophical intent. His treatise on tolerance, published in 1763 in the immediate aftermath of the Calais affair, was not a work of abstract philosophy. It was a detailed historical and legal argument that examined the actual consequences of religious intolerance across centuries, and concluded that no doctrine of divine love could rationally justify the treatment that the Church had inflicted on those who differed from it. He also wrote satire, including his masterpiece Candide, which used the form of a philosophical tale to expose the absurdity of comforting doctrines that could not account for the actual suffering of actual human beings. The approach was deliberately accessible. He was not writing for an academic audience that could already protect itself. He was writing for anyone who could read, because he believed that ideas needed public circulation to do their work. Voltaire's contribution to the philosophy of religion and institutional power was not a single grand argument, but a sustained demonstration that religious authority was not self-evidently sacred, that the history of its exercise raised questions that could not be answered by appeals to the authority itself, and that a civilization that valued reason, justice, and human dignity could not indefinitely defer those questions out of reverence for an institution that had used reverence as a tool of control. He was not the only Enlightenment thinker to make versions of this argument, but he was the most widely read, the most quoted, the most feared, and the most exiled. His words reached audiences that academic philosophy never touched, and that reach was precisely what made him, in the eyes of the institutions he criticized, genuinely dangerous. When Voltaire applied his lens to the specific mechanics of church power, the analysis became granular and uncomfortable in ways that abstract philosophical critique rarely achieves. Censorship was not, in his account, an unfortunate excess of otherwise reasonable institutional authority. It was a logical expression of what institutional authority becomes when it claims absolute certainty about truth. If you know with absolute certainty what is true and what is false, then the circulation of falsehood is not merely an intellectual problem. It is a moral and spiritual catastrophe. And if preventing a moral and spiritual catastrophe justifies extraordinary measures in principle, then burning books, imprisoning authors, and silencing dissent become not merely permissible, but obligatory. The logic of censorship flows directly from the logic of absolute doctrinal certainty. Voltaire understood this connection and made it explicit. The clerical privilege system was another target of his analysis. The Catholic clergy in pre-revolutionary France was the first estate, the highest social order, exempt from taxation, subject to its own courts, in control of vast economic resources, and possessed of a political influence that operated through every level of society. Voltaire did not oppose religious devotion. He opposed the equation of spiritual authority with social privilege, because that equation meant that challenging the doctrine became simultaneously an act of social rebellion and a spiritual crime. A priest whose comfortable wealth depended on the continued authority of the Church had a material interest in that authority that was entirely independent of his theological convictions, and a social system that protected that material interest through the language of sacred duty had created something that Voltaire recognized as profoundly dishonest. The practice of using orthodoxy as a weapon against political dissent was equally visible to Voltaire's historical eye. The charge of heresy in early modern Europe was rarely a purely theological matter. It was available as a legal instrument against anyone whose views, religious or otherwise, made them inconvenient to those in power. The Inquisition's mandate to investigate deviations from orthodoxy created a system of surveillance and denunciation that operated in the overlapping spaces between theology, politics, and personal rivalry. Neighbors denounced neighbors. Business competitors found theological language useful in commercial disputes. Political enemies discovered that a heresy charge was more devastating than a straightforward accusation because it carried the weight of divine disapproval in addition to legal consequence. Voltaire also examined the specific mechanism of fear in the Church's pedagogical system, the way children were educated into doctrines whose authority was presented as absolute before the children had any capacity to evaluate the claims being made. To teach a child that doubting the Church's teaching is sinful is not education in any meaningful sense. It is the installation of a psychological barrier against the very faculty, critical reason, that the child would need to evaluate the teaching. A grown adult who has been told since early childhood that a specific question is spiritually dangerous does not approach that question as a thinker. They approach it as a penitent, or they do not approach it at all. Voltaire saw this not as a side effect of religious education, but as one of its deliberate functions. An institution that could not survive rational examination had powerful reasons to ensure that examination felt like transgression. The punishment of dissent within the Church's own framework was a subject Voltaire returned to repeatedly because it provided some of his most concrete and historically verifiable evidence. Jan Hus, the Bohemian theologian who argued for reform of the Church in the early 15th century, was summoned to the Council of Constance under a guarantee of safe conduct and then burned at the stake in 1415 when his arguments proved unconvincing. Giordano Bruno, the philosopher and former Dominican friar who taught that the universe was infinite and contained many worlds, was burned in Rome in 1600 after 8 years of imprisonment. These were not peripheral cases. They were statements by the institution about what happened to the mind that traveled too far. Voltaire cataloged them with the precision of someone who understood that examples are arguments. The combination of all of these elements, censorship, clerical privilege, the weaponization of orthodoxy, the education of children into intellectual helplessness, and the public punishment of those who defied the system, produced what Voltaire identified as an atmosphere of intellectual terror that was entirely incompatible with the pursuit of truth. You cannot pursue truth in an environment where the wrong conclusions carry criminal penalties. You cannot reason freely when the categories of reason themselves have been pre-approved by an authority that will punish deviation. The Church, in Voltaire's account, had created a civilization-scale system for the prevention of honest thought, and it had done so while claiming that what it was protecting was the highest form of truth available to human beings. That was the doctrine under his examination, and his examination did not spare it. The implication that emerged from Voltaire's analysis was dangerous, not because it was violent or revolutionary in the political sense, but because it was logical. If a claim to truth requires the suppression of inquiry to survive, then the suppression itself becomes evidence against the claim. This is the kind of argument that institutions find particularly threatening because it cannot be answered by force. Burning the book that contains the argument does not refute the argument. It illustrates it. Every act of censorship, every exile of a philosopher, every book added to the index became, in Voltaire's framework, additional evidence for the prosecution. The implication extended to the nature of institutional authority itself. If the Church's authority rested ultimately on its claim to possess divine truth, and if that claim could not survive open examination, then the authority was standing on a foundation that its own behavior had quietly undermined. The political rulers who used church authority to legitimate their own power were therefore building their legitimacy on something that was becoming structurally unstable. When Voltaire wrote, "The French monarchy was deeply entangled with the church's authority. The revolution that would eventually tear both apart was still decades away, but the intellectual conditions that made that revolution thinkable were being created, in part, by the very excesses of the system Voltaire criticized. This was dangerous because it meant that the institutions did not simply face philosophical criticism. They faced a historical process that their own behavior was accelerating. The more aggressively the church censored, the more evidence it provided for the critic's central argument. The more spectacularly it persecuted heretics, the more those heretics became symbols of the cost of institutional certainty. The Callus case, which Voltaire turned into an international scandal, was not dangerous to the church because Voltaire invented its significance. It was dangerous because the church's own judicial machinery had produced it, and Voltaire simply refused to let it be forgotten. The deeper implication was about the relationship between faith and fear. The church's system of enforcement, from the Index to the Inquisition to the social penalties for association with condemned thinkers, depended on maintaining fear as a constant psychological pressure. Fear of heresy, fear of excommunication, fear of hell, fear of social exclusion, fear of the burning that awaited both manuscripts and their authors in the worst cases. If that fear was the primary mechanism keeping the system intact, then the system's relationship to truth was secondary at best. A truth that is believed primarily because the alternative is terrifying is not the same thing as a truth that is believed because it has been examined and found convincing. Voltaire wanted the distinction taken seriously, and the institution he was examining had very strong reasons to prevent that distinction from being made. The final and perhaps most dangerous implication of Voltaire's lens was the one he applied to the conscience of every individual believer. If an institution has used fear, authority, and the suppression of doubt to shape what you believe, then the belief itself has been contaminated, not necessarily in its content, but in its origins. A person who believes something because they were never allowed to doubt it has not really made a choice. They have undergone a process of formation that made choice impossible, and an institution that systematically prevents its members from making genuine intellectual choices about its claims is not offering faith. It is imposing conformity while calling it faith. That implication, that the difference between genuine belief and manufactured consent matters morally, was the philosophical knife that Voltaire drove most precisely into the machinery he was examining. Religious authority becomes socially useful the moment it begins to sanction the existing order of things. The church did not simply claim that God existed. It claimed that God had arranged human society in a particular way, that the hierarchies of power were reflections of a divine plan, and that the duty of the faithful was to accept their position within those hierarchies rather than to question them. This made religious authority extraordinarily valuable to anyone who occupied a privileged position within the hierarchy, because it meant their privilege was not a human arrangement that could be contested and dismantled. It was a reflection of God's design, which could only be opposed at spiritual peril. The practical consequences of this arrangement were enormous. Tax systems in which the clergy paid nothing while the poor paid heavily were not presented as exploitative economic arrangements. They were embedded within a theological framework that assigned different duties to different estates. The first estate, the clergy, served God through prayer and spiritual leadership. The second estate, the nobility, served God through military protection. The third estate, everyone else, served God through labor and tax. This division was not merely a sociological description. It was presented as a divinely ordered structure, which meant that to challenge it was to challenge God's arrangement of human affairs. The doctrinal language of estates and duties made what was essentially a class system seem like a cosmic architecture. Intellectual rebellion was equally suppressed by the useful belief in doctrinal authority. If the church was the authorized guardian of truth, then any philosopher who arrived at conclusions that contradicted church teaching was not simply wrong. He was dangerous because his conclusions, if allowed to circulate, might convince others to join him in his error. The suppression of intellectual dissent was therefore presented not as censorship, but as pastoral care. The index was not a tool of control. It was a warning system designed to protect the faithful from ideas that would damage their souls. This framing made the censors appear not as oppressors, but as protectors, and it made the censored thinker appear not as a victim, but as a source of spiritual contagion. The usefulness of religious fear in maintaining social stability was something that political thinkers had understood long before Voltaire. Niccolò Machiavelli had noted in the early 16th century that religion was politically indispensable as a tool for maintaining order among populations that could not otherwise be controlled by law alone. He meant it descriptively rather than approvingly, but the observation was accurate. A population that feared divine punishment for disobedience was cheaper to govern than one that required constant coercive enforcement. The internal enforcer of religious fear did the work that external enforcers could not do cheaply or reliably. Every confessor who reminded a penitent that social rebellion was sinful, every preacher who assured a congregation that suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next, was performing a function that served the interests of those at the top of the social hierarchy, regardless of their personal theological sincerity. The most sophisticated version of this useful belief was the theological argument for the necessity of authority itself. The fall of man in the dominant Catholic theological tradition had corrupted human reason and human will. Unaided reason could not be trusted to find truth. Unaided will could not be trusted to choose good. Therefore, human beings required authoritative guidance from an institution that, through divine grace, was able to provide the direction that corrupted individuals could not generate on their own. This argument was philosophically sophisticated, and it was not without genuine theological depth, but it also happened to be extraordinarily convenient for the institution that claimed to be the authoritative guide. The doctrine of human insufficiency made the institution that offered to remedy that insufficiency indispensable. And an institution that has made itself indispensable has a powerful incentive to maintain the conditions that make indispensability possible. What the system produced in the minds and lives of ordinary people was a particular kind of interior landscape, one shaped by the constant proximity of spiritual terror. The fear of hell was not an abstract theological proposition. It was, for many believers across centuries, a living presence, something felt in the body, something that activated in the middle of the night when doubt stirred, something that accompanied every major decision, with the question of whether this choice would be judged favorably at the end of all things. The Church did not invent human anxiety about death and judgment, but it did provide a specific, detailed, institutionally maintained architecture of that anxiety, complete with the precise conditions for damnation, the prescribed remedies, and the authorized dispensers of those remedies. The internalization of silence was one of the most consequential psychological effects of this architecture. Generations of people grew up understanding, at a level below explicit thought, that certain questions were not to be asked, certain doubts were not to be entertained, and certain books were not to be read. The prohibition was not always enforced by external authority in the daily lives of ordinary believers. It was enforced by the internalized voice of the institution, which had been installed during childhood education and reinforced by every subsequent sermon, confession, and communal practice. A person who has learned to feel genuine shame at the thought of questioning their inherited doctrine has not been physically imprisoned, but they have been enclosed in a psychological space that functions in many of the same ways. Guilt became a technology in this system, and it was an exceptionally effective one. The sacrament of confession, in which believers were required to enumerate their sins to a priest who then prescribed penance and offered absolution, created a regular and institutionally sanctioned moment in which a person's entire inner life became available for examination and judgment by an authorized representative of the Church. This was not without genuine pastoral value for many people who found in confession a genuine experience of relief and reconciliation. But it also meant that the Church had access to the interior of the believer's conscience in a way that no other institution possessed. And the categories of sin through which that conscience was examined were categories the Church had defined, which meant that the Church effectively decided what counted as guilt. The fear of disagreement extended into social life in ways that were difficult to disentangle from purely spiritual concerns. To express doubt about a doctrinal matter in the wrong company was not merely a theological risk, it was a social risk. Communities were organized around shared religious identity, and deviation from that identity threatened the bonds of community, family, and social belonging. People who began to question inherited doctrine did not do so in a vacuum of pure philosophical investigation. They did so in the knowledge that their questioning might cost them their relationships, their reputation, their employment, and in more extreme historical moments, their freedom or their lives. The social enforcement of doctrinal conformity meant that even people who harbored genuine intellectual doubts had powerful reasons to keep those doubts to themselves. The long-term psychological effect of this system, played out across generations, was something that Voltaire and later thinkers recognized as a kind of spiritual stunting. A mind that has been trained to associate curiosity with transgression, that has learned to experience the impulse to question as a spiritual danger signal, does not easily recover its natural range of motion, even when the external pressures that installed those responses are removed. The fear does not disappear when the index is abolished or when the Inquisition is dissolved. It lives on in the habits of thought, in the reflexive discomfort with certain questions, in the sense that some territory of inquiry is too dangerous to enter even now, even in private, even when no external authority is watching. This is what the system was designed to produce, and by any measure of its own goals, it succeeded with extraordinary thoroughness. What Voltaire mapped across decades of exile, satire, historical investigation, and philosophical argument was not simply a critique of one institution in one era. He was tracing the shape of something that appears wherever authority claims absolute certainty about truth. The transformation of a spiritual community into a system of intellectual governance. The specific doctrines change. The languages change. The architecture of the rituals changes. But the core structure, claim authority over truth, suppress the tools that might examine that authority, use fear to maintain the interior compliance of those who might otherwise question it, and brand every challenger as an enemy of what is sacred. That structure is recognizable across centuries and across very different institutional contexts. The transformation Voltaire documented was not sudden. It happened gradually, across centuries, through processes that felt, at each individual step, like reasonable responses to real threats. The early church faced genuine persecution. It faced genuine theological chaos in its first centuries, with dozens of competing interpretations of who Jesus was and what his life meant. The decisions made in councils and by bishops were made under real pressure, by people who believed they were protecting something genuinely important. The institutional machinery that eventually became the Inquisition and the Index did not begin as a system of terror. It began as an attempt to maintain coherence in a community that believed the stakes of theological error were eternal. But the scale of the transformation matters. Whatever the original intentions of the institution, by the time Voltaire was writing, the practical reality was a system in which the protection of doctrinal authority had become an end in itself, in which the means, censorship, surveillance, punishment, and psychological terror had become so thoroughly established that they continued operating even when the original rationale for them was no longer coherent. The Church could not afford to ask whether its methods were compatible with its stated mission, because asking that question would have required examining the mission itself, and the examination was exactly what the methods had been designed to prevent. The warning that Voltaire issued is not the property of a particular century. Every institution that claims authority over truth, religious, political, or otherwise, faces the same temptation: to confuse the protection of its authority with the protection of truth. When that confusion becomes complete, when the institution can no longer distinguish between the two, the suppression of questioning does not feel like intellectual tyranny. It feels like a moral obligation. That is the moment Voltaire identified as the most dangerous, and that is the warning that made him an exile, a banned author, and one of the most read thinkers of his century. This is the work that the heretic lens was built to continue. If you have stayed with this investigation this far, if you recognize in Voltaire's account something that speaks to a question you have carried privately for years, then this channel exists for that recognition. Subscribe now and join an ongoing archive of forbidden inquiry. Every week, this lens examines the beliefs you inherited, the history behind them, the authorities who challenged them, and what becomes possible when fear loses its authority over your thinking. The investigation continues. The archive is far from closed. The historical evidence for Voltaire's central argument does not require embellishment, because the historical record is sufficiently dramatic on its own terms. The burning of the library at Alexandria has sometimes been romanticized as a single catastrophic act of cultural destruction. But the actual history of institutional censorship across the Christian era was not a single event. It was a sustained practice with legal infrastructure, administrative personnel, and documented outcomes. The Lateran Council of 1515 required that all books be approved by church authorities before publication. This was not a suggestion from an advisory body. It was a formal decree of an ecumenical council, carrying the full weight of church authority, issued a full 2 years before Martin Luther posted his theses and permanently fractured Western Christianity. The trial of Galileo Galilei in 1633 is one of the most thoroughly documented cases of institutional authority suppressing scientific inquiry in the historical record. Galileo had published evidence, drawn from telescopic observation and mathematical reasoning, that supported the Copernican model of a sun-centered solar system. The Church's response was not to engage the evidence. It was to summon Galileo before the Inquisition, to threaten him with torture, to force him to formally abjure his findings, and to place him under house arrest for the remaining 9 years of his life. His dialogue concerning the 2 chief world systems was placed on the Index, where it remained until 1835. The message sent to every natural philosopher in Europe was clear. If the evidence leads you to conclusions that conflict with authoritative doctrine, the conflict is to be resolved in favor of the doctrine. The Edict of Fontainebleau, issued in 1685 by Louis XIV at the instigation of his Jesuit advisors, revoked the Edict of Nantes, which had provided French Protestants, the Huguenots, with a degree of legal toleration since 1598. The revocation resulted in the expulsion of somewhere between 200,000 and 900,000 Huguenots from France, the destruction of their churches, the forced baptism of their children, the closure of their schools, and the prohibition of any Protestant religious practice on French soil. This was not a medieval event. It occurred during the reign of the Sun King, at the height of French power and cultural prestige, within the memory of people who were alive when Voltaire was born. He knew it as recent history, not as distant legend. The specific case of the Chevalier de la Barre, which occurred in 1766, just 3 years after Voltaire won the posthumous rehabilitation of Jean Calas, illustrated the continuation of the system with particular brutality. De la Barre was a 19-year-old nobleman who was accused of failing to remove his hat before a religious procession and of possessing a copy of Voltaire's philosophical dictionary, among other alleged acts of impiety. He was tortured, had his tongue cut out, and was beheaded, after which his body was burned along with the copy of Voltaire's book. He was 19 years old. The book that was burned with his body had not killed anyone. The institution that ordered his execution did so in the name of a God who, according to the Gospels, had refused to call down judgment on those who crucified him. The parallel with the treatment of early Christian heretics inside the Church's own tradition provided Voltaire with evidence that the pattern was not an external accident. The Cathars, a Christian dualist movement that flourished in southern France in the 12th and 13th centuries, were subjected to the Albigensian Crusade, a military campaign organized by Pope Innocent III, which resulted in the massacre of entire communities. The phrase attributed to the papal legate at the siege of Béziers in 1209, "Kill them all, God will know his own," whether historically accurate or legendary, captured the logic that Voltaire analyzed. When authority is certain of its divine mandate, the normal constraints on human violence become negotiable. The evidence accumulated across centuries into a pattern that Voltaire refused to allow history to present as a series of unfortunate exceptions. The pattern extended into Voltaire's contemporary moment through the machinery of lettres de cachet, royal orders that could imprison any individual without trial, without stated charges, and without a fixed term of imprisonment. These orders were frequently obtained by ecclesiastical authorities against thinkers, publishers, and booksellers whose work offended doctrinal sensibilities. The philosopher Denis Diderot Voltaire's contemporary and colleague in the project of the Encyclopédie, was imprisoned in the Château of Vincennes in 1749 for writing material that the authorities deemed contrary to religion and morality. The Encyclopédie itself, the great project of enlightenment, thought that attempted to organize all human knowledge according to rational rather than theological categories, was officially condemned and its privilege revoked in 1759. The strongest evidence for Voltaire's argument was not something he had to construct, it was something he had to resist. The defense of the Church's use of authority, censorship, and doctrinal enforcement during this period is not without genuine philosophical and historical substance, and it deserves to be stated seriously rather than dismissed as mere rationalization. The Church operated in a world that was, by any modern measure, intellectually and socially precarious in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from the distance of several centuries. The printing press had made the circulation of ideas dramatically faster, cheaper, and less controllable than at any previous point in human history. In that environment, what looks from a later vantage point like censorship looked to contemporaries like an attempt to maintain intellectual and social order in the face of genuinely destabilizing forces. The Reformation, which erupted in the same century as the establishment of the Index, demonstrated exactly what happened when doctrinal authority broke down and religious communities were left without an authoritative framework for resolving theological disputes. The result was not a serene flowering of free inquiry. It was over a century of religious warfare, political fragmentation, and social violence that killed millions of people across Europe. The Church's defenders could argue, not without some historical support, that the institutional structures Voltaire criticized, however imperfect and sometimes cruel, had also maintained a degree of social and intellectual coherence, that the alternative, unconstrained doctrinal pluralism, had demonstrably failed to produce peacefully. Order, the argument ran, has a value that becomes visible precisely in the moments when it collapses. The theological argument for the Church's authority was also more sophisticated than Voltaire's satirical treatment always acknowledged. The claim was not simply that the Church was powerful and therefore right. The claim was that the Church had been constituted by a divine act, that its authority derived from a commission that transcended the institutional arrangements of any given era, and that the faithful were therefore obligated to submit to its teaching not because the teaching could be verified by independent reason, but because the submission itself was part of what faith meant. This is a coherent position, internally consistent, and one that many serious theologians have defended with genuine intellectual rigor. It does not require the believer to abandon reason entirely. It requires the believer to apply reason within a prior commitment to the authority of revelation. The protection of vulnerable populations from predatory ideas was another element of the Church's defense that cannot be entirely dismissed. In a world of near universal illiteracy, in which the vast majority of people lacked the educational resources to critically evaluate competing claims, an unrestricted market in theological ideas was not necessarily a recipe for intellectual freedom. It was potentially a recipe for exploitation by charismatic demagogues, for the spread of ideas that were not merely heterodox, but genuinely harmful, and for the destruction of communal bonds that gave meaning and support to the lives of ordinary people. The Church's claim that it was protecting its flock, rather than imprisoning it, was not pure cynicism in every case. Many individual clergy genuinely believed they were performing an act of pastoral care. The objection also points to the genuine achievements of the Church during the same period that Voltaire criticized. The universities of Europe were largely church foundations. The preservation of classical learning through the medieval period was largely a monastic achievement. The development of natural law theory, which became a foundation for later arguments about human rights, was a theological project. The abolitionist movement in Spain, led by figures like Bartolomé de las Casas, drew explicitly on Catholic theological premises about human dignity. The church that burned heretics was the same institution that produced Erasmus, Thomas More, and Thomas Aquinas, the institution within which much of what we now identify as Western intellectual culture was developed and transmitted. A critique that ignores these achievements is a critique that flatters itself by seeing only what confirms its conclusions. The objections are real, and Voltaire's lens is not the only way to look at this history. But the central problem that Voltaire identified does not dissolve when you acknowledge the Church's genuine contributions or when you place its excesses in historical context. The problem is structural, not incidental. An institution that claims authority over truth and simultaneously claims the right to suppress the tools through which truth is typically examined has not resolved the contradiction between those two claims by achieving good results in other areas. The Inquisition's cruelties are not cancelled out by the libraries of Benedictine monasteries. The burning of De la Barre is not made less significant by the humanitarian work of Bartolomé de las Casas. The argument that social order required doctrinal control also contains within it an uncomfortable concession. If the authority of doctrine rested on its truth, then truth should have been able to maintain social order through persuasion rather than enforcement. If enforcement was necessary to maintain order, then the order being maintained was not a product of truth freely recognized, but of power carefully applied. Voltaire's point was precisely that these two things, truth and power, are not interchangeable, and that an institution which treats them as interchangeable has made a choice about which one it primarily serves. That choice, once made, tends to be self-reinforcing. The more an institution relies on power to maintain its claims, the less it can afford to subject those claims to the examination that might distinguish truth from power. The theological defense of submission to authority without rational verification faces a problem that its most sophisticated proponents acknowledged even within the tradition. It provides no principled way to distinguish between a genuine divine mandate and a false one. If the criterion for accepting authority is not the rational examination of the authority's claims, but rather the prior commitment to the authority's legitimacy, then any sufficiently powerful institution can generate the same level of compliance by presenting the same structure of claims. The Church had no argument against competing authorities that did not eventually rest on the same assertion it began with, that its authority was genuine because it said it was. This is not a circle that rational examination can break from within. It can only be broken by insisting, as Voltaire insisted, that the examination must happen. The argument that historical context explains and partially excuses the Church's excesses is legitimate to a point, but it cannot become a permanent intellectual safe harbor. Historical context explains why people acted as they did. It does not establish that they acted well, and more importantly, an institution that claims timeless divine authority cannot appeal to historical context when its actions fall below the standards of timeless divine authority. If the Church's authority transcends the contingencies of history, then its behavior cannot be excused by appealing to those contingencies. The institution either inhabits history, in which case its authority is historical and therefore revisable, or it transcends history, in which case the persecutions of the 16th and 17th centuries cannot be explained away as products of a different time. Voltaire noticed this logical problem and pressed it with characteristic precision. The final reason why the problem remains is the most immediate one. The psychological effects of the system Voltaire documented did not end when the Inquisition was dissolved or when the Index was finally abolished in the mid-20th century. They were transmitted across generations, encoded in habits of thought, in the reflexive discomfort with certain questions, in the association between doubt and spiritual danger, in the sense that some territory of inquiry must not be entered. People who have never heard of the Index, who have no knowledge of the Callus affair, who cannot identify John Hus or Giordano Bruno, still carry, in some cases, the psychological residue of a system that was designed to make certain questions feel like sins. That residue is what this channel was built to examine, and Voltaire's insistence that the examination must happen is as relevant now as it was in the 18th century. When you have looked at the Church's authority through Voltaire's lens, when you have traced the history of the censorship machinery, the economic interests of the clergy, the political utility of divine sanction, and the psychological architecture of religious fear, the institution does not disappear, but it changes shape in your perception. What appeared to be a purely spiritual structure now reveals its second dimension, a political and economic institution with identifiable interests, identifiable strategies for protecting those interests, and a history of applying those strategies in ways that caused real harm to real human beings. The spiritual and the institutional are not two separate things that happened to share the same buildings. They were deeply intertwined in ways that shaped each other in every direction. This double vision, seeing both the genuine spiritual hunger that the Church addressed and the institutional machinery that was layered around it, is not comfortable. It is much simpler to see the Church as either entirely sacred or entirely cynical. The entirely sacred view requires ignoring too much documented history. The entirely cynical view requires ignoring the genuine depth of belief, the genuine pastoral care, the genuine intellectual achievement, and the genuine experience of grace that millions of people found within the institution across centuries. Voltaire himself resisted the entirely cynical view because he recognized that ordinary believers were not the architects of the system that had shaped them. They were, in many cases, its most thorough victims. The authority of Scripture looks different after this examination as well. The Church's claim that it was the authorized interpreter of Revelation and that unauthorized interpretation was dangerous was not simply a theological position. It was a gatekeeper claim with institutional consequences. The history of biblical scholarship that emerged from outside institutional church control, including the textual criticism that developed from the 17th century onward, reveals a scripture that is more historically complex, more textually contested, and more humanly shaped than the Church's claim of authoritative interpretation had typically acknowledged. The examination of that complexity is not the destruction of the text's significance. It is a more honest engagement with what the text actually is. The relationship between morality and religious authority also appears differently. One of the Church's most powerful claims was that morality without divine authority had no foundation, that an institution that claimed the right to define good and evil on the basis of revelation was providing something that secular philosophy could not replace. Voltaire's counter-argument was not that morality had no foundation without religion, but that an institution which had persecuted, tortured, and killed in the name of moral authority had forfeited its claim to be the reliable source of moral wisdom. His positive alternative was a moral philosophy grounded in reason, in the recognition of human suffering as a shared condition, and in the principle that tolerance was not weakness, but a fundamental requirement of civilized life. That argument is not the destruction of morality. It is an attempt to put morality on a foundation that does not require the suppression of honest inquiry. The experience of individual believers who lived within this system appears, after examination, in a light that is simultaneously more sympathetic and more complicated. The person who genuinely feared hell, who genuinely felt guilt at the stirring of a doubt, who genuinely experienced the sacraments as moments of divine contact, was not stupid or simply deceived. They were human beings living within a comprehensive world-making system that had shaped their perceptions from the earliest moments of their lives. The examination of that system is not a judgment of those people. It is an attempt to understand the forces that shaped them, in the same way that understanding the forces that shaped any historical situation is a form of intellectual respect for the people who had to navigate it. The examination of church authority that Voltaire conducted, and that this episode has followed across its evidence and its philosophical analysis, does not lead logically to the conclusion that every priest was a cynical manipulator, that every believer was a helpless victim, or that the entire religious tradition of Western Christianity was nothing more than a system of political control dressed in theological language. History is not built from pure motives or pure corruption. It is built from human beings who were simultaneously capable of genuine spiritual conviction and institutional self-interest, often in the same person, often without full awareness of the contradiction. The critique of institutional power is not a critique of the spiritual impulse that institutions attempt to serve. People across all of recorded history have sought something beyond the merely material, have experienced moments of transcendence, community, meaning, and moral orientation that they found within religious frameworks. That seeking is not pathological. It is not evidence of intellectual weakness. It is part of what human beings appear to be. The question Voltaire raised was not whether spiritual seeking was legitimate, but whether any specific institution had the right to monopolize it, to claim exclusive ownership of the divine, and to punish those who sought by different paths. The defense of tolerance that Voltaire spent his career constructing was not a defense of indifference. He was not arguing that all beliefs were equally valid, or that it did not matter what anyone thought about anything. He was arguing that the method of coercion, the use of fear, punishment, and suppression to maintain doctrinal uniformity, was incompatible with both truth and human dignity. That argument is compatible with deep personal conviction. It is compatible with religious devotion. What it is not compatible with is the claim that any institution has the right to impose that conviction on others through the machinery of terror. The people who sit in churches today, who pray, who find meaning in the sacraments, who experience their faith as a genuine and life-shaping encounter with the divine, are not therefore the targets of this critique. Inherited belief, examined honestly and held with intellectual courage, is not the same thing as manufactured conformity maintained by fear. The distinction matters, and maintaining it is part of what makes this kind of historical and philosophical investigation morally serious rather than merely provocative. What becomes possible after this kind of examination is something that fear had always blocked from view. When the authority of an institution no longer functions as an absolute prohibition on certain questions, the questions do not become terrifying. They become interesting. The history of Christian thought, examined without the prior commitment to defending institutional orthodoxy, is an extraordinarily rich intellectual landscape, full of debate, creativity, dissent, mystical experience, philosophical sophistication, and genuine spiritual depth. Much of that richness was suppressed by the institutional need for uniformity. Recovering it does not require abandoning spirituality. It requires abandoning the specific institutional claim that uniformity is the same thing as truth. Voltaire's vision of what lay beyond institutional intolerance was not a cold, mechanical universe stripped of meaning. It was a world in which human beings could engage with the deepest questions of existence, about God, about morality, about death, about the nature of reality, without the prior obligation to arrive at a specific set of conclusions on pain of spiritual or physical punishment. He believed that reason, honestly applied, was not the enemy of genuine spiritual life. He believed it was the enemy of the fear-based substitute for spiritual life that institutional authority had in many cases installed in its place. That distinction between living faith and manufactured conformity, between genuine inquiry and enforced certainty, is the legacy of his work. The maturity of belief that becomes possible after this examination is something different from both naive acceptance and cynical rejection. A person who has examined the history of the institution that shaped their inherited beliefs, who has looked honestly at the contradictions between that institution's stated mission and its documented behavior, and who has still found, in the depths of that examination, something worth holding, is holding it more genuinely than they were before. The examined belief, even if it ends in agnosticism or a revision rather than a return, is a more honest response to the actual complexity of human existence than the unexamined belief that was maintained by making examination feel like sin. The freedom that Voltaire pointed toward was not freedom from meaning. It was freedom from the specific kind of meaning that requires silence to survive. It was the freedom to ask whether a belief is true without being told that the question itself is dangerous. It was the freedom to read, to think, to doubt, to examine, and to arrive at a conclusion through the exercise of a mind that has been allowed to function without the prior installation of an internal censor. That freedom is not the property of atheism. It is available to anyone who insists that their faith, if they hold it, must be able to survive honest questioning. Voltaire called that insistence reason. This channel calls it the beginning of the investigation. The world that Voltaire imagined was not a utopia of pure philosophical clarity. He was too much of a realist, too much of a historian, to believe that human beings would suddenly reason their way to universal agreement if institutional authority were removed. He knew that ignorance, cruelty, and fanaticism were not exclusively the products of religious institutions. They were human tendencies that would find other hosts when the religious ones became inhospitable. His hope was more modest and more durable than utopian thinking, that the examination itself was worth doing, that the cultivation of the habit of honest inquiry was more likely to produce justice and dignity than the alternative, and that any civilization that valued truth had to be willing to extend that value to the institutions that claimed to guard it. That hope is not small, and it is not finished. A sentence can still become a kind of crime, not always in a court, but in a community, a family, a congregation, a conscience that was shaped before it knew it was being shaped. The burned book and the silenced thinker are historical figures, but the impulse they represent to protect a specific authority from the examination that might reveal it as something other than what it claims to be has not disappeared from the world. Voltaire recognized it not because he hated the church in the way that a personal enemy hates a rival, but because he understood the logic of what happens when any institution, sacred or otherwise, places the protection of its own authority above the pursuit of the truth it claims to represent. That recognition is not the end of the investigation. It is the reason the investigation must continue. The question this episode leaves open is one that Voltaire spent his life pressing, and it has not found a final answer in the centuries since. When a religious institution suppresses inquiry in order to protect doctrine, is it protecting truth, protecting power, or has it reached the point where it can no longer tell the difference? Leave your answer in the comments below, and tell this archive what you think happens when an institution can no longer distinguish between the two.